Welcome to A Focus On. I'm your host, Mandy Yeahpau. With me today is Julie Akins, journalist, activist, and Ashland City Councilor, and also Carol Voisin, who is editor and director of the AshlandChronicle.com. Today the focus is on death of small town media. Let's give you a little background about ourselves first. I'll go. Again, my name is Mandy Yeahpau, but if you're from Southern Oregon and you've been reading the news for a long time, you may recognize me by my maiden name, which is Mandy Valencia. I'm raised here. I've lived in Ashland for years. I graduated from SOU with a communications degree in convergent media. I'm a former journalist, although once a reporter, always a reporter, so I still very much care about news gathering and consumption in the Rogue Valley. I worked for the Ashland Daily Tidings starting in 2007. Where I worked there until they closed the newsroom down, and then I moved over to the Mail Tribune in Medford. I adminned both of the Daily Tidings and the Mail Tribune websites, where I gave breaking news updates on the site. I was a crime reporter, among other beats. I started and ran all of the social media pages for both newspapers. I trained everyone in the newsroom how to use social media. I produced several award-winning web series for both newspapers and also ran video contests and tried to drive a lot of traffic to the websites. I was also a photojournalist, and I stayed until 11 p.m. every night of my shift, copy editing the paper and listening to the scanner and putting the paper to bed, as they say, when we send it off to press. So I'd taken about every position there is in the paper that you can do, and I loved every minute of it. I just couldn't keep doing it because it did not pay a livable wage for me in the Rogue Valley. So now I specialize in digital media, and I work as a communications consultant. Julie, you want to tell us a little bit about your background?
First of all, you have a very impressive background.
Oh.
Thank you for sharing that with our viewers. Well, I have been a journalist for 30 years. I've worked all over the country. Before coming back to this area, I was in San Francisco at Channel 4, Chron 4 News, and I covered the North Bay. But I've been an investigative reporter through most of my career in Tampa, San Diego, Baltimore, had some very rich experiences doing that. Then I came here and I was the news director at Channel 5, the NBC affiliate, and I taught journalism at SOU when that was still a major. And I also freelanced for the Ashland Daily Tidings, and I'm currently still a writer and a journalist. I freelance, and that's kind of a hard racket these days, but I do it. And I serve on your Ashland City Council, and I'm an activist for issues of social justice and equity.
Beautiful. We're so honored and we're so grateful to have you in our community being so active. Thank you.
Thank you.
Carol, will you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I'm not a journalist. I've grown up in academia. I have a doctorate in systematic theology, and for 16 years I taught ethical thinking for the 21st century at SOU to new students coming to SOU. So I learned a lot about students and where they're at and what they're doing, and really enjoyed that. Recently retired. And after Trump, our president, won, there were several of us, probably a dozen of us, decided we can't handle this. We have to have something that will give us real news. Because what we were getting from the Tidings and the Tribune didn't quite match the reality we were experiencing. So we started the AshlandChronicle.com, which is basically right now a website, but it's going to be much more soon. So that also tells you that I'm an advocate for independent news. I think that's incredibly important that we have more independent media, and I'm committed to doing that.
I love it. Excellent. Yes, it's so needed. Yeah. I mean, all of us here are longtime consumers and writers of local news, and I want to start talking about kind of what we're used to, the environment that we're used to with local news and TV stations that we've worked with historically, because they've slowly been in decline. Like I mentioned, I was one of the last people to be in the Ashland Daily Tidings newsroom. There was probably 10 to 12 of us working there when I started, and then There was 3 of us there when we moved over to the Mail Tribune. Yeah, and then even at the Mail Tribune, when I was there, I saw the writing on the wall. You know, people leave and they go on to other careers or other positions, and then those positions are just not filled, and it's empty desks in the newsroom, and it's scary when it's your livelihood, and it's also like so important to you, you know. So I didn't know, Julie. I mean, what can you say a little bit about the history of news? You've worked in it for so long, and also just the importance of a paper of record too. I love what you've said about that in the past.
Yeah, well, I think that we started seeing trouble years and years ago when ownership rules changed, and it became acceptable for one owner or one corporation to own multiple television, radio, and newspaper outlets across the country. And that squeezed the number of voices that were being heard and the way that media was being covered. And I think there was some sort of feeling that it would work its way out through digital media. That hasn't really been true, because digital media is not newspaper of record typically. Now we are seeing some good sites emerge. The Hill, ProPublica has a site. Frontline, which works through PBS and the Center for Investigative Reporting, has a site. The Poynter Institute, and I can slow down on those, but there are some good sites. But still in all, it's not the same as a local newspaper of record. And what that means is a newspaper that every day has people, professionally trained journalists, vetting information for verifiable truth and covering things that are happening in your community on a daily basis. And that doesn't mean just reading a city council agenda and watching it on RVTV, although I'm really happy that people can do that. But it means more than that. It means questioning city councilors, questioning staff, trying to figure out what's really true as issues emerge. And I don't really feel we have people doing that on a regular basis in our local news organizations. That isn't to say that I'm blaming the journalists. What we're dealing with is an environment where, like so many industries, it's all about money, money, money. And when you have an industry that's been squeezed the way it is, and journalists trying to take on 5 and 6 jobs at once. You know, when I started as a reporter, I had a photographer, I had a videotape editor, I had a producer and an assignment editor, all these people trying to make these stories be the best that they could be. And now these young reporters are out here on their own, and by the way, being paid peanuts.
Right.
Yes.
When I started in 1980, I started at $26,500 a year. When I was hiring journalists at Channel 5, I was hiring them for that same amount. And this is, you know, 7, 8, 9 years ago.
Right.
Obviously, things cost more. So it's just the whole industry has been squeezed. Journalists have been squeezed. There are some good folks, you know, Patsy Smolin and KOBI, that's a locally owned television station. They deeply invested in this community, and I think they are making the efforts that they can to survive in an environment where it's almost like a race to the bottom. It's like how little can we spend and how much can we pump out that may or may not have true value. I mean, that's,
that
I hate
was
to
my
be harsh, but
no,
that's how I
that
see
was
it.
my experience too. I mean, when I was there, so I was doing all these jobs, right? I had to be the photographer, I had to be the videographer, I had to write the story itself. Then I had to do a post an update on the website. Then I had to share it on our social media. So, you know, I'm doing all these different roles, right? And then I'm being paid about $300 every 2 weeks. Which you can absolutely not survive on, which like I say, I love it. I loved it. But you just can't survive on it. And then you also have to be deeply embedded in the community, right? Like these things really, it mattered to me. It wasn't just a job. When I would see, I got a lot of my stories off of Facebook, believe it or not, because I'm deeply embedded in the community, because I'm friends with a lot of people that know about what's going on, or they know me. They know to call me up and say, there's a situation happening up here that's escalating and it's getting really bad, and I know something bad's going to happen. Something actually happens, just like how the police often can't arrest somebody until they actually break the law. But you can keep your eyes on these things and you can invest in them. But when you're tapped, when you don't have a newsroom full of journalists, and you have so many other things going on, you know, you can't follow up on all these leads, right? So it is really problematic. And ultimately, it isn't the journalist's fault. They're just squeezed for bandwidth. These old models, the traditional media model just doesn't work. When I was there, the only way we actually were still in business was because corporation, by News Corp. I was there because we were definitely not paying for ourselves. We knew absolutely that we were not making enough money. And the digital model doesn't always work, because with that paywall, if you tell the ad reps, go sell digital ads, you know, these businesses want to know how many web hits, how many eyeballs are on your website that I know I'm paying. Well, when you have a paywall, people are bouncing off of there all the time. Yeah. So it kind of cannibalizes yourself. It, you know, cuts you off at the knees, because you can't sell the ad revenue because of the paywall. Right. You can't, you know, and because of the paywall, people are not going there. So it's difficult. And these models, they haven't, when I was there, I was trying to figure out something that would work. I was actually working on some app development for maybe something that would supplement our classifieds, where like some kind of yard sale app where you could see what people are selling on their yard sales and go to them, and it would be all through the, you know, be monetized. But, you know, they're just looking at ideas, throwing spaghetti at the wall and seeing what sticks, because these old models don't work. So who suffers is people that want local news. You know, you can't afford to have a reporter at all these high school games. One sports editor cannot, you know, cover all the different regional games, and that's important to people, and the strength and the community and the connections that we need, you know, as a society, I believe. So it's hurtful. One thing I touched on that I wanted to bring up was the different ownerships, you know, in the newspapers, and how newspapers are bought and sold pretty frequently. That was my experience there, and if you track any paper, you'll see that they, you know, are bought and sold many different times. And when I worked for the Mail Tribune and the Daily Tidings, did you want to say something?
Yes.
Okay.
Are they always for profit or non-profit?
Always for profit.
Always
I've never
for
known of a
profit.
non-profit.
News organizations are always for profit. Okay.
Even though it's a public service.
Primarily, right?
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, there's always that exception. There are a few that are not, like PBS does the PBS NewsHour,
Right.
Yeah.
and that's a not-for-profit.
JPR?
And JPR is a not-for-profit. The Ashland Chronicle currently is not a for-profit, and it's a pretty good paper. I do urge people to read it. So I think there are some models, and I don't want to cut you off. I know we have more to talk about.
Yeah.
There are some models that might work, though, talking about it in a more not-for-profit, community-based orientation, which may be where we need to go. I don't know.
Or community-owned.
That's what I always thought too, because it's a public service, and it's so important. It's just then who is paying for that public service is problematic, right? I always thought, well, what if the city pays for it, right? Or what if, but then you're writing this news for the city, or what if it's some billionaire that buys the paper and is paying for it? Then you are, you know, you could be, you know, behooving to what they want you to print. So it's difficult where the money is coming from, right? But nonprofit definitely, or at least community serves, you know, sourced and independent. I definitely, I actually donate to several different independent news outlets, because I just believe it's so important. And right now I just haven't figured out a better model, right? So as we talk about ownership of papers, our local newspaper, the Mail Tribune and the Daily Tidings, were recently purchased in 2017 by Rosebud. Most people are aware of that. It was purchased for $15 million, which that purchase price is actually 7 times the newspaper's 2016 adjusted earnings.
Holy moly.
Wait, 7 times what it's really worth?
Basically, yes. Yeah.
Wow.
Which I can never figure out. I don't know why a company would pay 7 times the worth. It doesn't, especially in an industry that's been in decline for so many years, right? It's very curious. Julie, when you worked as a freelance journalist for Rosebud, can you comment on whether that ownership changed how the news was being reported or not?
Well, it changed how it was being reported by me, I can tell you that. Before Rosebud bought it, I was I was turning stories 6 a week. I was really busy. My editor was very active and involved in my stories and read through them, asked really good and critical questions. Sometimes I had to go back and do them again, get more information, which is what you want as a journalist. You want to be called to account. and make sure that the best story is possible out there. And I was able to, prior to Rosebud, able to do a 3-part, really intensive investigation on how the city of Ashland deals with homelessness, especially as it pertains to citations. And what we found is that the city of Ashland wrote more citations involved with illegal camping than any other city in Oregon, and more than the city of Denver, Colorado, which has a huge homelessness issue. So it was a pretty
population.
And population,
yeah.
Huge, right?
Yeah.
So that was a really seminal piece that I was hired to do.
Mm-hmm.
It was 3 parts.
Mm-hmm.
Each part was 1,000 words. It's unheard of in newspapers, and they gave me that kind of freedom. And that was the last thing I got to do for the paper before Rosebud came in and took over full ownership. And a short time after that, I was taken off of City Beat and no longer worked at the paper, which frankly broke my heart. And I don't think the editor was excited to do it. It was something that I can't speak to it. He didn't tell me. I just know that that relationship ended. And then I know shortly thereafter, it felt as if there was getting less and less local content, more and more video content that felt like it was coming from somewhere else, not the local community. So I can say that that was my experience, and I can also say that as a reader and a follower of journalism, and then also serving on the council, I can say that it feels as if there's a lot less local involvement and investment, to me, in my opinion.
Correct.
That's
right.
how
yeah,
I
hear
see
you.
it.
Yeah. That was my observation as well, just being a former staffer myself. I noticed too, like in the election cycle in 2018, it didn't seem like the coverage was equal like I was used to seeing. I was seeing a lot from some candidates and not just every candidate in the field. And I actually spoke with a few candidates about it too, and they said they had to call the newspaper themselves and ask for equal coverage, which I felt embarrassed, even though I didn't work there anymore, that they had to do that because...
Did they get it after that?
I don't know. I don't know. So, I mean, myself and some of my colleagues definitely observed some changes, and then pretty quickly this partnership was announced with Sinclair Broadcast Group. KTVL News has now in partnership with Rosebud. They've actually moved them into the newsroom with them, where they're sharing
the
a
Mail
newsroom.
Tribune?
Yep, the Mail Tribune and KTVL are sharing a newsroom, which that's unheard of a newspaper and a TV station working out of the same newsroom. As I mean, when I was there, it was like,
but it's rare.
Yeah. It was quite a surprise to me. Some things that are interesting too are, according to public records, a financial statement shows that Steven Zaslow, who's the chair and owner of Roseburg, got money from Sinclair Broadcast Group and used all of Rosebud's assets as collateral. In that same week, he purchased both the newspapers, the Ashland Daily Tidings and the Mail Tribune. So we don't know how much money he received, and we don't know if he used that money to buy the newspapers that same week, but it's definitely questionable. It's definitely fascinating and curious.
Can I
Yeah.
go back? I don't want to make sure I understand this. So what you're saying is that the publisher of the local newspaper borrowed money from Sinclair?
We don't know if he borrowed it, but he received money from them and used Rosebud as collateral for that money. And we don't know how much money he received from them, but he received a chunk of change, I assume, whatever Rosebud's worth, because that's the collateral. And then that same week bought the newspapers.
And that's your opinion?
Well, that's public record.
Oh, okay.
So that definitely happened.
That definitely
That
happened.
Okay.
The money
Well,
was received from Sinclair to Rosebud. Rosebud bought the newspapers within a 1-week span.
Well, that certainly is curious.
That's very curious.
And then, now that Rosebud owns the Mail Tribune, all of a sudden the Sinclair Broadcast Group, KTVL, moves into the newsroom, and now there's a partnership. So it just makes me wonder, what is the relationship that Sinclair has with Rosebud, and what is Sinclair's interest in Rosebud and in the Mail Tribune and the Daily Tidings?
And this matters why?
Well, it matters because, there's been actually quite a bit of reporting about Sinclair's mandatory statements that it's issued to editorial outlets that they own. They've actually, down from the line, said you have to say this. And you can look online, there's supercuts of TV reporters saying the exact same verbiage. So that they have a heavy-handed agenda. It does lean right-wing. Have we seen that in our local papers show up? That would be up to opinion. My opinion is I feel like I've seen that. You would have to read it and you would have to come to your own conclusion on that. It's something of note because I haven't ever observed that when I worked at the paper. That was not the case. I was never told to say certain things. I reported what I reported on my own, what my findings were, what my sources were. I didn't experience that. And if Sinclair is now entered into a partnership with the Mail Tribune, we wonder what those newsrooms being together. How is our news being put together? How is it being gathered? And what kind of influence does Sinclair have? I have these questions, right? And we actually reached out to Steven Zaslow of Rosebud to ask if he could come on the show and maybe discuss it with us and talk about it, clarify some of these questions, and he declined. And then the next communication that we got was from Bill Carey, who, as we understand it, works for Rosebud, although I cannot figure out what his title is. It's not listed anywhere on the internet or online. But he has a Rosebud email. And in his Rosebud email, he emailed one of our producers. And I'm going to read just an excerpt because this was a really interesting follow-up from our request for participation. It says, "It's come to my attention that a recent taping program for RVTV claiming that Sinclair Broadcast Group controls the editorial processes of the Mail Tribune and the Ashland Daily Tidings. If you have not yet aired the program, we demand that you not broadcast it and edit it to exclude all false and defamatory statements made therein. If you have already aired it, we demand that you refrain from further airing the program and immediately publish a full and complete retraction of the statements at issue. We also demand that you take down and retract any similar statements that may have been made in RVTV affiliated and employee social media accounts. If such steps are not taken, we're prepared to take further action to remedy these falsehoods and protect Rosebud Media and its publications from reputational and pecuniary harm, up to and including commencing legal action against your outlet and any and all media outlets that repeat this falsehood." So what they're concerned about is us saying that Sinclair controls editorial processes of these newspapers. So to be clear, we have not said that. We have not said that they do that. What we've said is that they have announced that they have a partnership with Sinclair and that they share a newsroom with Sinclair. So if Sinclair doesn't have any influence on the editorial process, how do you share a newsroom with the Sinclair Broadcast Group outlet and report news would be my question. And why are you so worried about it and so threatened by us even talking about it on public access on RVTV, us three ladies that just care about accurate and fair news reporting, to send, in my opinion, a threatening email, in my opinion, a very aggressive email?
Well, I think it's fair to say that it's threatening. It says if you say this, something will happen. And then it also, doesn't it use the language of falsehood? But nothing has aired, so how would they know if anything we're saying is untrue? Like, we're just now talking about it.
Right. So they sent this without knowing what the content was.
That's
and
troubling.
without even
that really
anything
is.
airing.
That's troubling.
That's a bully. I'm sorry. You don't do that to people. At least you view what they've done, what they're presenting,
Yeah.
and make comment on that. But to say it before it's even done, I think that is
Right.
That's impeding.
Even like everything that you know about journalism is like, well, what is the information? Well, if they don't have any information, they haven't even seen this yet. Like we're reading the letter right now because they haven't even know what we're talking about.
Right.
Well, and I mean, we don't know, as you said, we don't know Bill Carey's relationship in the newsroom. We don't know if Bill Carey is a journalist, a manager, a consultant. we don't, there's a lot we don't know, probably more we don't know than we do. But I would be concerned about anybody who is accusing someone of saying falsehoods before they even know what the person has said, being involved in any way with a news organization, because let's
Right.
hope that no one is reporting the same way.
Yeah.
Let's hope that
Right.
someone isn't sitting with a magic 8-ball and predicting what I'm going to say in a city council meeting and then calling me saying don't say it before I've said it. Let's hope that that's not how they run their newsroom. Do you see my correlation there?
Oh, yes.
Right,
Yes.
right. Yeah, it's jumpy, right? It's very assumptive.
But again, I don't know. I don't know Bill Kerry's relationship. We've said we don't know the specific relationship between Rosebud and Sinclair, and that's true. We don't know that, and I don't know how Mr. Kerry or the newsroom in general gathers information. But I do know this letter seems to be ahead of itself. They certainly seem to be ahead of their skis on sending a letter like
Yes,
that. I
I
can
agree.
say that.
Yeah.
Well, to me, in my opinion, it's weird. It would be, I wish that they would just come on the program and talk about it, or talk about what the relationship is like. Since they've announced this partnership, they've been very open about sharing a newsroom with the KTVL, newsroom. So why not talk about how that works instead of sending, in my opinion, aggressive emails? Just give us some straight answers, because
Right.
I'm interested in news. I want to know how the news is being reported. I hope that it's being reported in an ethical way, in a fair way, and I want to know, how it's changed and how it may be biased. But that's why we're bringing it up here, because what can we do about it? We can just know about it. We can know what the facts are. We can ask questions about it and think about it, and we can bring it up for others to know that our news processes locally have appeared to have changed. And then what are our options? So you want to talk about the Ashland Chronicle
First,
a
I
little
would
bit
like
too?
some clarification from the two professional journalists here.
Yeah.
What happens in a newsroom? I have no idea. I mean, if they're sharing a newsroom, isn't there a line that says Mail Tribune and Ashland Tidings and you don't cross the room? How do you do that?
I mean, I don't think so. Certainly when I worked at the Tidings, and I'm sure this was true for Mandy too, some of my stories also ran in the Medford Mail Tribune.
Well, it's the same newsroom.
It's the same newsroom, and it's jointly owned. So there was no separation there in particular, except the beat you covered. I was in Ashland, so I covered Ashland, and I don't think I ever went to Medford for a story, maybe once. But yeah, there's no separation there. So without going into the newsroom and looking to see what KTVL does in the newsroom as compared to what the newspaper reporters do, I couldn't say for sure. But typically when I have observed shared services agreements, and I was an executive in the broadcast business for years, what that usually meant is a sharing of resources. That usually meant that some of the TV reporters would also write for the website or the newspaper, and some of the newspaper reporters would go on camera at the television outlet. That's normally why you have a shared services agreement, so that you can have more reporters in the field and they can work for both outlets. Whether that's true for the Tidings and the Tribune and KTVL, I don't know. But typically, isn't that, it's a shared service? Wouldn't you
Yeah.
assume that? But I can't say for sure. I have not gone in their newsroom and interviewed their folks.
I'm very curious. I would love to see what the newsroom looks like. I would love to see what the layout is like. I would love to see, how is that even arranged? I can't even imagine, because when I was there, this was like, the TV stations were our competition. We were trying to
I would
scoop the
think
stories
so.
before them, and we were trying to cover them better than them.
Yeah.
And the TV stations sometimes would report my stories, and if they didn't source me or source the Mail Tribune, I was offended. There was one story of mine that I worked very hard on that a TV reporter said, information has become available. And I about threw something at the TV, because I was like, that didn't just come out of nowhere. I worked really hard for months and months to get these sources and to make this really interesting story come together. So I'm very curious to see how that is in a working condition. And I wish that they would be more upfront about it and less defensive about it, because that's a red flag to me, in my opinion, is this, what are you so worried about? What's wrong with that? If this is okay and if this is a partnership and everything is on the up and up, then why don't you want us talking about it?
Well, as an alternative, what several of us decided was that we need more investigative journalism.
Yes.
And so we have tried to do that. And we have a couple of reporters who are journalists who can do that and do that for us. But we also invite citizens to submit their articles, whether it's to the city council or whether it's to just the general public. Several people have tried to get their letters to the editor published through the Mail Tribune and or the Ashland Tidings, and they won't do it. And the reason is it's too controversial, or you don't have your facts right, and those kinds of things. But several, not just one or two. I mean, I'm talking about dozens of people who have written editorials, letters to the editor, and have been pushed away. And so we get those and we put them on our website so that we have a citizen's response to what's happening in our community. So we have eyes on our community and we see what's going on and where the issues are and where the celebrations are. And I think that's really important that we keep our news local.
Yeah.
And that it's run by people who are local.
Yes.
And know what's going on in our community. I think that's critical.
Are invested in our community.
That's
yeah,
right,
absolutely,
yeah. And that's independent news.
Yeah.
And I just think that's terribly important. And I think we should fight for that.
Yep.
And do all that we can to make that happen.
When I saw it going away, it made me really sad. And I just thought, well, I think maybe it has to go away before people realize how important it is and what they're missing out on when they're searching for why did this happen or what happened with this, or I saw an ambulance going by, where this, you know, when they can't get those answers, you know, and you can't always find it on Facebook or anything, you know, and that is where a lot of people are getting their news. But this is such a great solution to that because you can kind of vet it in a way, you know, you ask questions.
Oh yes, the AshlandChronicle.com. We have a couple of editors who look at what's going on. We make sure it's not fake news.
Right.
We know it's real.
Right.
And then we post it.
Because journalism is supposed to be many voices.
Yes.
And that's really the biggest issue with these shrinking newsrooms, right? When you have less people that are trying to report all this, it's supposed to be all these voices, and you don't have as many voices when you don't have as many people. But when you can depend on a community, which my experience being at a community paper, a lot of the stories, they were just people telling me this happened. You might want to know about this. You might follow up on this. And then you have, you know, the journalists doing their work of actually following up on it. But it's community based, and it's multiple voices, and it takes everybody together.
And diverse voices.
Yes.
I think we have to have diversity in our voices. If we don't, we're missing the whole purpose of being a community.
Absolutely. There's things going on with the Latino community that people have no idea. There's things happening with the Native American community that folks just wouldn't know anything about unless you have a community source news base. So it's important that we vet that. Any other news that we're seeing other places, right? And maybe double check it. I don't know if we have time to speak to that just a little bit. But just supporting independent media and news is so important.
One question I have of you two journalists is, how do you determine what news is?
Oh, wow. This has been one of those questions. And
I don't mean philosophically.
I understand,
really,
from a practical.
Right.
I'm laughing because a news director famously said, news is whatever I say it is. And all of us cringed. We we don't need to be saying that. News is events that are happening in your community that are important for your fellow citizens to know about. I think in the simplest terms, that's what it is. So it's an organization that is a watchdog. That's its role. It holds public entities accountable to the public. It looks at spending, it looks at policy, it looks at impact in community, and sometimes it's also just talking about other folks in the community that are doing cool stuff that you might want to know about. Sometimes it's about events coming up. But it's largely those things that are of interest and importance to the community as reported through verifiable truth and as objective as possible. I think,
that's beautiful.
Well said.
Yeah.
So what's the difference I have one other question, sorry.
okay.
not being a journalist. What's the difference between
You're doing pretty good
a
as a
journalist
journalist, actually.
Yeah.
and investigative journalism? What's the difference?
Well, I'll give you my spin on that.
Okay, good.
There's no difference, really. The difference
that's
is that
good.
journalism
Time.
is journalism. It's time and the ability to dig deeply into a particular subject.
Okay.
When I was doing that kind of work, I would have 3 or 4 stories that I was investigating at the same time. And those stories would pop when they were ready, when I had all the appropriate number of sources, when I had vetted it, when I could document it, and when I had a team of lawyers look at it to make sure that we were really right on track. And sometimes those stories would take me between 6 months and a year before they had
Wow.
all the information available before I could put that on the air. But it's really no difference except for that. Time
see, okay.
and the need to dig deeper. You don't really need an investigative reporter to cover a city council meeting. It should be transparent what's happening, right? It's not always, but it should be transparent.
Right.
An investigative reporter might go to a city council meeting and say, it looks like these guys have talked about this prior to the meeting, and I don't think that should be happening. What's going on? And then they ask other questions.
Right.
If that does
Very
that-
good. That's
clarify?
good.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's my question. Yep.
And listen, we could go on and on about it, and maybe we will. Maybe we
I
should
know.
do another show
Oh,
to dive a little
I
bit
think
deeper
this is
because
great.
I love investigative journalism too. And before I left the papers, I did a series that meant a lot to me too.
What was it?
On opioid addiction, and basically was the
Whoa.
first story to link back over prescribing of opioids to our opioid
Yeah.
crisis.
And another thing I think would be fun to discuss is how do you pay for it?
Well,
How do you finance
that's
really
no,
good-
I don't know if we've all figured that out
our
yet.
news?
Yeah, that's the
So we
toughest
need
part.
to figure it
We
out.
need to
and
figure
we
that
need
out.
to see your byline again, doggone.
Okay.
Just putting it out there.
All right. Well, thank you so much. We've come to the end of our show. Thank you for joining us. We would like to thank SOU for their support of RVTV Public Access Television, and a big thank you to all this volunteer crew running the cameras and the switchboard. Without you, this program would not be possible. I'm Mandy Yeahpau, and we will see you next time, and again, hopefully.
Thank you.